It began with a document no one was supposed to see quietly carried through a private corridor at Windsor, shielded from aides and buried beneath layers of protocol. But when Princess Anne placed it before King Charles III, the silence in that room spoke louder than any royal decree. What she revealed wasn't just personal, it threatened to rewrite everything the crown believed about loyalty, legacy, and bloodline. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in that private meeting has never been officially confirmed, yet reports suggest it was unlike any routine royal briefing. There were no aides standing by, no secretaries quietly documenting the exchange, no ceremonial formalities to soften the weight of what was about to be presented. It was, according to various interpretations from palace insiders, a controlled and deliberate confrontation, one shaped not by emotion, but by obligation. Princess Anne, often described as the monarchy's most unyielding enforcer of duty, had arrived with something far more significant than a routine update. She carried sealed archival material believed to be tied to Prince Philip, documents that had remained buried within the deeper institutional memory of the crown. Those familiar with the internal workings of the House of Windsor suggest that such documents are rarely brought forward without consequence. They are not casual records, they are fragments of intent, carefully preserved reflections of decisions made in quieter times when the future of the monarchy was being shaped behind closed doors. And according to whispers circulating within royal-adjacent circles, this particular collection may have pointed toward long-standing preferences, subtle, undocumented inclinations that were never meant to surface in the present day. The reaction of King Charles III, as described by those who claim knowledge of the moment, was not explosive but deeply telling. There was no immediate rejection, no visible dismissal. Instead, there was a pause measured, heavy, almost reluctant. A pause that insiders now interpret as recognition. Because whatever those documents contained, they were not entirely unexpected, just never meant to be confronted so directly. Some reports even suggest that Charles had been aware, in fragments, of certain internal dynamics shaped during his father's lifetime, but never in a form so structured, so undeniable. And then there is the matter of timing. Why now? Why bring forward something so sensitive at a moment when the monarchy is already navigating pressure, scrutiny, and internal recalibration? Sources close to palace administrative circles hint that this was not an impulsive act. It was calculated. A deliberate decision by Princess Anne to surface a truth that could no longer remain buried without consequence. Because in an institution built on continuity, even the quietest revelations can carry the loudest implications. What makes this moment even more unsettling is not just the existence of these documents, but what they imply about the past. That somewhere within the carefully maintained structure of royal duty, there may have been preferences human, complex, and quietly influential that shaped decisions in ways the public was never meant to fully understand. And as palace insiders continue to whisper about a so-called buried directive, the narrative begins to shift from speculation to something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that legacy itself is not as fixed as it appears. But the truth Anne carried wasn't just about the past, it pointed to a decision that could fracture the very balance of power inside the monarchy. For decades, it was assumed that loyalty within the House of Windsor followed a clear and unquestioned line. But what if that assumption was never entirely true, and what if the foundations of that belief were quietly shaped by a man who understood legacy better than anyone? That question does not emerge lightly, nor does it exist in isolation. It lingers, building on the tension left behind by the revelation that has already begun to ripple through the inner structure of the monarchy. Because to understand what those documents might mean, one must first understand the mind believed to be behind them. Prince Philip was never simply a supporting figure in the royal story. Reports suggest he operated as something far more. Calculated, a strategist who viewed the monarchy not just as a family institution, but as a living system that required constant adjustment, discipline, and, when necessary, quiet intervention. Those who have studied his decades of service often describe a man who preferred influence over attention, structure over sentiment, and long-term stability over short-term comfort. It is within that framework that his role begins to take on a different shape. Various interpretations of archival material, and internal memoranda hint that Philip may have played a more active role in shaping institutional continuity than was ever publicly acknowledged. Not through overt declarations, but through subtle reinforcement guiding expectations, defining standards, and quietly positioning individuals where he believed they would best serve the crown. This was not favoritism in the conventional sense, at least not as it has been traditionally understood. It was, according to some insiders, a form of calculated alignment, a belief that the survival of the monarchy depended on placing duty above visibility, discipline above popularity, and resilience above perception. And it is here that the name Prince Edward begins to emerge with new weight. For years, Edward has existed within the royal structure as a steady, almost understated presence, rarely dominating headlines, rarely stepping beyond the boundaries of expectation. But those familiar with the internal rhythm of royal operations often describe him differently. They refer to him as the quiet executor, a figure whose consistency, discretion, and unwavering adherence to protocol made him uniquely reliable in ways that were not always visible to the public eye. Unlike others who carried the burden of prominence, Edward's strength, it is whispered, lay in his refusal to seek it. This contrast becomes increasingly difficult to ignore when placed alongside the broader dynamics of the royal family, where some figures are defined by charisma or public engagement. Edward's role appears rooted in something quieter but no less significant, a form of loyalty that does not demand recognition. And if the suggestions surrounding Philip's long-term thinking hold any truth, then this distinction may not have been incidental. It may have been intentional. A reflection of a philosophy that valued endurance over spectacle and quiet service over visible authority. References to estate considerations, internal correspondence, and strategic planning documents, though rarely confirmed, add further complexity to this narrative. They suggest that Philip's vision for the monarchy may have extended far beyond ceremonial roles, reaching into the deeper mechanics of how influence, responsibility, and trust were distributed within the institution. And if that is the case, then the implications of what has now surfaced are far more profound than they initially appear. Because this is no longer just about individual relationships, it is about the possibility that the monarchy itself was being quietly shaped by principles that were never meant to be fully revealed. And as those hidden layers began to surface, one question echoed through palace walls: why was this never meant to be known? When the documents were finally laid out, there was no dramatic outburst, only a stillness so heavy it felt deliberate. Because what they revealed wasn't explosive in volume, but devastating in implication. What followed, according to those familiar with the moment, was not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but something far more unsettling, a controlled unveiling of fragments that, when placed together, formed a narrative too significant to ignore. Princess Anne did not rush, did not dramatize, did not allow emotion to distort the process. Instead, she moved with precision, presenting what has been described as a structured collection of materials, letters, notes, and internal directives believed to trace back to Prince Philip. Each piece on its own might have seemed inconclusive, but together they suggested something far more deliberate, a pattern of thought, a quiet consistency in how Philip may have viewed the future of the institution he had spent decades protecting. Reports suggest that within these materials were subtle yet unmistakable indications, references to roles, expectations, and responsibilities that appeared to align more closely with Prince Edward than with the broader assumptions held by the public. Not declarations, not explicit endorsements, but something quieter and perhaps more powerful. A tone of trust, a repetition of confidence, a sense that Edward's position within the structure of the monarchy carried a weight that had never been openly acknowledged. And it is this quiet consistency, insiders claim, that made the revelation so difficult to dismiss. Because it did not shout, it did not demand attention. It simply existed, patient, deliberate, and impossible to fully ignore. Once seen, the reaction of King Charles III has been described in equally restrained terms, yet those same descriptions carry an unmistakable undercurrent. There was no denial, no immediate rebuttal, no attempt to reinterpret what was being presented. Instead, there was a visible shift, subtle but undeniable, a tightening of expression, a pause that lingered just long enough to suggest recognition. Those who have observed Charles closely over the years often point to his ability to maintain composure under pressure, but in this moment, composure itself became the signal. Because beneath that control, something had clearly been unsettled. And perhaps that is where the true weight of the moment resides. Not in the suggestion of favoritism alone, but in what such favoritism might imply. Because within the monarchy, roles are not simply assigned, they are inherited, reinforced, and protected through a system that depends on clarity and continuity. To introduce even the possibility that those dynamics were influenced by quieter preferences is to challenge the very foundation on which that system stands. It raises questions that cannot easily be answered. Questions about intention, about trust, about whether the visible structure of authority has always reflected the deeper currents beneath it. Insiders have described the moment as quietly seismic, a phrase that captures the paradox of what unfolded. There was no immediate rupture, no outward collapse, and yet something shifted. Something internal, something structural, something that may not reveal its full impact immediately, but cannot simply be undone. The evidence itself remains, by most accounts, open to interpretation. It does not impose a single conclusion, nor does it offer a definitive answer. But its significance lies precisely in that ambiguity, because in an institution built on certainty, even uncertainty can be destabilizing. But if the past had already been written, the real danger now lay in how this revelation would shape the future. For years, their roles had been clearly defined, one the sovereign, the other the steady supporter. But beneath that structure, there may have been an unspoken imbalance that no one dared to confront. Because what once seemed like a perfectly ordered hierarchy now carries a different weight in light of everything that has surfaced. The relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward has long been understood through the lens of tradition, one destined to lead, the other to assist. It is a dynamic that has rarely been questioned, reinforced by decades of public appearances, ceremonial roles, and the visible structure of royal duty. And yet, as the implications of those newly surfaced materials begin to settle, that once unquestioned balance feels less certain, as though something essential has been quietly overlooked. Those who have followed Edward's role within the monarchy often describe him in terms that do not easily align with the simplicity of his public position. He is not the most visible, not the most discussed, not the figure most associated with authority. But insiders frequently point to a different kind of strength, discipline that does not waver, discretion that does not falter, and a commitment to the institution that exists without the need for recognition. It is this consistency, this almost unyielding steadiness, that has led some to question whether his contributions have been fully understood, or even fully acknowledged. In contrast, the role of King Charles III has always been shaped by visibility, expectation, and the immense weight of succession. His position is not just one of authority, but of constant scrutiny, every decision examined, every action interpreted within the broader narrative of the crown. And while that visibility carries its own form of burden, it also defines how value is perceived within the institution. What is seen becomes what is recognized. What is recognized becomes what is remembered. And in that equation, quieter forms of service can sometimes fade into the background, even when they are foundational to the system itself. This is where the emotional complexity begins to deepen, because the question is no longer simply about roles, it is about legacy. About how loyalty is measured, how trust is assigned, and how influence is understood within a structure that depends on both tradition and perception. If the suggestions surrounding Prince Philip and his long-term thinking hold any weight, then the relationship between Charles and Edward cannot be viewed solely through its outward form. It must also be considered through the lens of intention, what was valued, what was reinforced, and what may have been quietly prioritized behind the scenes. And as this realization begins to take hold, a subtle but undeniable shift starts to emerge. Not in titles, not in formal authority, but in perception. Among those who operate within the higher levels of royal structure, there is said to be a growing sense of unease, a recognition that something fundamental may not align as neatly as it once appeared. Conversations become more cautious, interpretations more layered. The certainty that once defined these relationships begins to give way to something more complex, more uncertain, and far more difficult to ignore. Because if value within the monarchy is not determined solely by position, then where does true influence reside? And if loyalty has been measured in ways that were never fully visible, then how much of the institution's internal balance has been shaped by forces that have only now come into focus? These are not questions that can be easily resolved, nor are they questions that can be dismissed. They linger, quietly reshaping the way each role is understood, each contribution evaluated, each relationship reconsidered. And while the brothers remained outwardly composed, the institution around them began quietly adjusting to a truth it could no longer ignore. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and scandals, but its greatest vulnerability has always been what happens behind closed doors, when loyalty is tested not by the public, but by the past. Because what has begun to surface is not simply a question of personal dynamics, it is an institutional challenge, one that reaches into the very core of how the monarchy defines itself. The House of Windsor has always relied on a delicate balance between continuity and control, a system where perception is as powerful as reality. Yet when internal revelations begin to disrupt that balance, the consequences extend far beyond private conversations. They ripple outward, quietly influencing authority, shaping perception, and testing the unity that the institution depends on to endure. What makes this moment particularly significant is the nature of the revelation itself. It does not come from external pressure, nor from public scrutiny, but from within. History has shown that internal fractures, no matter how subtle, carry a different kind of weight. They are harder to contain, more difficult to reinterpret, and far more dangerous to ignore. Because when questions of legacy begin to emerge from inside the institution, they do not simply challenge individual roles, they challenge the structure that supports them. This is where the idea of legacy becomes more than a reflection of the past, it becomes a force shaping the present. Disputes even. Implied ones over how influence was distributed, how trust was assigned, and how value was measured can alter the way authority is understood moving forward. For those observing from the outside, royal historians, commentators, and longtime watchers of the crown, this moment has already begun to generate quiet speculation. Not dramatic headlines, but careful analysis. Interpretations that attempt to understand what this shift might mean, not just for those directly involved, but for the institution as a whole. And at the center of it all remains the enduring presence of Prince Philip. His influence, by all accounts, did not end with his lifetime. If anything, it appears to have been designed to extend beyond it, embedded in the very framework of how the monarchy operates. The possibility that his long-term thinking may still be shaping events today introduces a layer of complexity that cannot be easily resolved, because it suggests that what is unfolding now is not entirely new, but rather the continuation of something set in motion long ago. For King Charles III, this creates an almost impossible position. On one side lies the responsibility to preserve stability, to maintain the image of unity, continuity, and control that defines the crown. On the other lies the weight of truth, or at least the acknowledgement of it. To dismiss what has surfaced would risk ignoring something fundamental, but to fully engage with it could invite questions that extend far beyond what the institution is prepared to confront publicly. It is a tension that does not demand immediate resolution, but one that cannot remain indefinitely unresolved. And so the monarchy finds itself in a moment of quiet recalibration. Not a visible transformation, not a dramatic shift, but something far more subtle and perhaps more profound. A reassessment of values, of roles, of the unseen forces that have shaped its path. Because in an institution built on the strength of its past, even the smallest shift in understanding can carry the weight of something much larger. Because in the end, this was never just about preference, it was about what kind of monarchy would emerge from it. There was no official statement, no immediate correction, just a silence so controlled it felt intentional, as though every word not spoken carried more meaning than anything that could be said. In the days that followed, that silence began to take on a presence of its own. It was not empty, nor was it uncertain. It was deliberate. Within the inner workings of the House of Windsor, restraint has long been one of the most powerful tools available, in unspoken understanding that not every truth must be acknowledged publicly in order to be managed privately. And this moment, according to those familiar with the rhythms of palace response, reflected that philosophy with striking precision. There was no attempt to dismiss what had surfaced, but neither was there any move to confirm it. Instead, the institution chose stillness, allowing the weight of the situation to settle without interference. This kind of silence is rarely accidental. It is, as many royal observers suggest, a form of control. By withholding reaction, the monarchy maintains authority over the narrative, preventing it from spiraling into something uncontrollable. It creates space for internal recalibration, for measured decisions, for the careful alignment of what must be preserved and what can be quietly absorbed. And yet, beneath that composed exterior, there is always movement. Subtle, strategic, and often invisible to those outside the inner circle. At the center of that quiet control remains Princess Anne, whose role in this unfolding situation appears to extend far beyond the initial presentation of evidence. She has long been regarded as the guardian of institutional integrity, a figure who operates not for recognition, but for preservation. Her actions, according to various interpretations, are rarely impulsive. They are calculated, rooted in a deep understanding of how the monarchy must function in order to endure. And in moments like this, where uncertainty threatens stability, her influence becomes even more pronounced not through public statements, but through the quiet enforcement of order behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Prince Edward remains exactly as he has always been: composed, measured, and almost deliberately distant from the center of attention. There is no visible shift in his behavior, no indication that he seeks to engage with the narrative that has begun to form around him. And perhaps that is precisely what makes his position so significant. Because in a moment where recognition could alter perception, his refusal to step forward reinforces the very qualities that have defined him all along. Steadiness, discipline, an unwavering commitment to duty that does not require acknowledgement to exist. For King Charles III, however, the silence carries a different kind of weight. It is not simply a strategy, it is a necessity. He stands at the intersection of personal history and public responsibility, forced to navigate a path that demands both restraint and awareness. To speak too soon would risk destabilizing the institution he has sworn to protect. To remain silent, however, requires him to carry the burden of what has been revealed without the relief of resolution. It is a balance that cannot be easily maintained, yet one that defines his role in this moment, more than any declaration ever could. And so, the monarchy absorbs the shock not through visible reaction, but through controlled endurance. There is no fracture, no outward sign of disruption. But beneath that surface, something has shifted quietly, subtly, and perhaps permanently. Because when an institution built on certainty is confronted with ambiguity, it does not collapse. It adapts. Slowly, carefully, and always with purpose. Yet silence in the world of the crown is never the absence of action. It is often the beginning of something far more calculated. Sometimes power doesn't change hands, it simply reveals where it has always been, quietly resting, waiting for the moment it can no longer be denied. What began as a contained revelation has now moved into something far more subtle, yet far more consequential, a quiet recalibration that does not announce itself, but is felt in the shifting weight of perception. Within the inner structure of the House of Windsor, influence has never been defined solely by titles or formal authority. It has always existed in layers, shaped by trust, consistency, and the unspoken understanding of who can be relied upon when the institution is under pressure. And now, as the implications of what has surfaced continue to ripple outward, those layers are being examined in a way they have not been before. At the center of this recalibration stands Prince Edward, whose role, once perceived as steady but understated, is beginning to take on a different kind of significance. There is no sudden elevation, no formal acknowledgement that alters his position in the hierarchy. And yet, among those who observe the internal dynamics of the monarchy, there is a growing recognition that his value may have always extended beyond what was visible. It is not a transformation of status, but a redefinition of understanding, a realization that influence does not always align with prominence, and that the quietest presence can sometimes hold the strongest foundation. This shift does not occur in isolation. It is accompanied by the reinforced presence of Princess Anne, whose role as a guardian of legacy now carries even greater clarity. Her actions, once seen as firm but routine, were seen as firm but routine, are increasingly understood as part of a larger responsibility to ensure that the integrity of the institution remains intact, even when confronted with uncomfortable truths. She does not seek to reshape the monarchy in visible ways. Instead, she preserves it by confronting what others might prefer to leave untouched. And in doing so, she solidifies her position not just as a participant in the system, but as one of its most decisive protectors. For King Charles III, however, the recalibration presents a far more complex challenge. He is not merely observing this shift, he is at its center, tasked with reconciling what has been revealed with the role he must continue to fulfill. The past, once distant and settled, now feels closer, more immediate, far more influential than it once appeared. And the future, which depends on stability and clarity, now carries an added layer of uncertainty. Because to acknowledge the implications of this moment is to accept that the structure he represents may not be as fixed as it once seemed. Yet to ignore it would risk overlooking something fundamental to the institution's identity. Beyond the individuals directly involved, the broader implications begin to take shape. The monarchy as an institution has always defined loyalty in terms that are both visible and unseen. Duty, service, and public commitment form the outer layer, but beneath that lies something more complex, a network of trust, expectation, and internal alignment that determines how the system truly functions. And now, as observers, historians, commentators, and those closely attuned to royal dynamics begin to reflect on what this moment represents, a new understanding starts to emerge. Not one defined by titles or formal declarations, but by perception. By the recognition that influence, once assumed to follow a clear path, may have always been more nuanced, more layered, and more quietly distributed than anyone realized. This is not a revolution. It is not a visible shift that alters the outward form of the monarchy. Instead, it is something far more subtle, a change in how the institution is understood, both from within and from the outside. A recognition that power, in its truest sense, does not always need to assert itself. Sometimes it simply waits. And when the moment arrives, it reveals itself not through action but through clarity. And as that perception began to settle, it left behind a single, unavoidable realization. In the end, it wasn't the documents themselves that changed everything, it was what they forced the monarchy to confront about its own history. Because what had been uncovered was never just ink on paper or words preserved in archival silence. It was intention, it was design, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, it was continuity evidence that the influence of Prince Philip had never truly faded, but had instead been embedded into the very structure of the institution he helped shape. Reports suggest that his approach to legacy was never accidental. It was deliberate, methodical, and deeply rooted in a belief that the monarchy could only survive if it remained anchored to discipline rather than emotion. And now, with those long-buried ideas resurfacing, the crown finds itself confronting not just what was done, but why it was done and whether that reasoning still holds power today. What makes this realization so powerful is the way it reframes everything that came before. The monarchy has always been defined by its ability to endure, to absorb pressure without fracturing, to adapt without appearing to change. That resilience is not a coincidence. It is the result of generations of careful calibration, of decisions made in moments that were never meant to be fully understood. And yet, as this chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that adaptation does not come without cost. Because to evolve, even quietly, requires the institution to acknowledge the forces that shaped it, and not all those forces align comfortably with the narratives that have been presented to the world. There is also a deeper truth beginning to emerge, one that does not offer easy answers. Legacy, within the monarchy, is not always visible in real time. It does not announce itself with clarity or certainty. Instead, it moves beneath the surface, influencing decisions, guiding relationships, and shaping outcomes in ways that only become apparent much later. And when those hidden layers are finally revealed, they do not always provide resolution. Sometimes they simply raise new questions. Questions about intention, about fairness, about the delicate balance between personal loyalty and institutional duty. For King Charles III, this moment represents something deeply personal, even if it cannot be publicly framed that way. He stands at the intersection of past and present, carrying the responsibility of leadership while navigating the quiet weight of what has been uncovered. There is no clear path forward, no definitive answer that resolves the tension between what was and what must be. And yet, the role demands continuation. It demands stability. It demands that the monarchy move forward, even as it absorbs the implications of what it has been forced to confront. At the same time, figures like Princess Anne and Prince Edward remain steady, their roles unchanged in form but perhaps transformed in meaning. Their presence reinforces a principle that has always existed at the core of the institution: duty above all else. Not duty as a performance, but as a commitment that persists regardless of recognition or acknowledgement. It is this principle that ultimately allows the monarchy to endure even when its foundations are tested by truths that were never meant to surface. And so, there is no dramatic conclusion, no definitive resolution that brings closure to what has unfolded. Instead, there is something quieter, something more reflective. An understanding that the monarchy will continue, as it always has, shaped by both what is known and what remains hidden. It will adapt, it will endure, and it will carry forward the weight of its own history, not unchanged, but not undone. Because in the end, survival has never depended on perfection. It has depended on the ability to reconcile with complexity, to move forward without fully resolving the past, and to preserve the institution above all else. Because in the House of Windsor, the past is never truly buried. It waits, patiently, for the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.